No.
So I'm here with my buddy James Santiago, the great James Santiago, sound designer for Universal Audio, the greatest audio company that does recording gear and all that
How
kind
much
of
is
stuff.
that going to cost me when you're done saying
I will talk about that later. And my old buddy Dweezil Zappa.
Hello,
And
Noah.
thank you, buddy, for coming in. I
Sure.
can't thank you guys enough. Love you guys. I mean, and, you know, James is going to, from time to time, kind of be my sidekick on some of these podcasts that we're going to do. And Tim Pierce is going to do some. And it's going to be really cool. And, you know, before we get into all the guitar geek stuff, I want to talk about something because I think Dweezil and I have shared some type of a life experience. And I figure I'll bring this up. I don't know how many people have brought this up to you, but my folks named me Norman. And what the hell were they thinking? I mean, you know, it's like I'm going, either I've got to be a real fast runner so that I don't get beat up on a regular basis, or I got to do something kind of special just, you know, to keep people away from me. What about you, Dweezil?
Well, you know, I've been asked a few times. My dad was asked a few times because obviously my name is a little bit unusual. But these days, people name their kids all kinds of things. So it's probably not as unusual as it once was. But when my dad was asked about it, often, you know, he had a response that I thought was pretty funny. He said, well, consider the beauty of a name like Ralph.
There you go.
So he said, at least, you know, why not do something different? And, but, you know, I mean, as a kid growing up with the name Dweezil, it was obviously a little bit of a strange thing because every so often you'd think, you know, I would think to myself, wait a minute. I do have a weird name, you know, like back when you had to collect calls and you'd have to talk to an operator. You're like,
I bet the operators are getting a kick out of that.
Yeah, that didn't always work out, you know. So, but I got used to it, and I did have an experience of my own though that made it fine for me with my own name because, you know how some kids decide to be a bit of a bully in certain situations. You know, I was in a shoe store when I was about 5 or 6. There was a kid who was a little bigger than me, and he was over by the K-Swiss shoes. You remember those, of course. And he says to me, "What's your name?" I said, "Dweezil." He goes, "That's a stupid name." I said, "What's your name?" He said,
Ralph?
Buns. Buns.
Oh, Buns? Oh, all right. There you go.
So I thought my name was far superior to Buns.
And what was, you know, there was something that I heard about that when your mom was about to give birth and you were going in the hospital. There was another name, Motorhead?
No, well, see, Wikipedia likes to make up all kinds of stories that then you end up having a call that comes in right at the same time, you know,
Always.
because Wikipedia is on the case. They're like, wait a minute, you can't say that we make up stories.
Yeah, which I
But, yeah, so, but...
Totally professional here at the Norm Guitars podcast.
So what you know, if you try to do research, you might find all kinds of things that are not exactly correct. But the real story is that when my dad filled out the paperwork saying what my name was, the nurses at the office, you know, in the office at the hospital, said, well, you know, you can't name a child that, and we're not going to let you see your child until you put some normal names, you know, on there. So it said my first name, Dweezil, and then it said Ian Donald Calvin Euclid, because those were people that were in my dad's band at the time.
Oh, there you go.
Underwood. Anyway, those names, when I found out those middle names, Ian Donald Calvin Euclid, when I was, again, around 5 or 6, I said, I don't like those. Let's get rid of those.
Got to get you beat up as well.
Yeah. And the funniest thing was that I was fine with most of them, except like the one that sounded worst to me at the time was Ian. Like Euclid was like, okay, that was okay. But I don't know why, you know. So now, of course, I've had them stricken, and it's just Dweezil Zappa.
Well, I'm trying to get Norm stricken, but I think it's a little late in the game. So let me ask you, James and Dweezil, how did you two characters get together? Because I know you guys are old buddies, and I know you're both great guitar players. So
Well,
There's an official story and an unofficial story, but I'm like my wife, I'll say, what's your version of the story? What do you remember?
All right, so
Yeah.
so I started a band where I was going to be playing my dad's music, and I needed to find a bunch of different instrumental players that could do different things. And so one of the people that auditioned, in fact, one of the very first people that auditioned for the band was a great musician named Sheila Gonzales. And Sheila, she came in and did this audition where she didn't realize that she didn't have to do what she did during the audition. And so basically she was supposed to come in and play keyboard, saxophone, and also flute. And this one song called Peaches on Regalia has all of those in one song. But she could have just played each section separately, but she came in and it was almost like a vaudeville show where she played just enough to be able to switch fast enough from keyboards to flute to saxophone, and she played the whole song just with a drummer, and so she was the person that I was like, oh, of course, I have to hire her. She's amazing. And she's been in the band ever since 2006. But at a certain point, she started hanging out with Mr. James Santiago.
Well, I know accounting for taste, boy. I'll tell you that.
No, that's exactly a good way to explain it. Is yes, I had actually seen the band in the first incarnation because another friend of mine, Jamie Kime, was also playing in the band at the time, and he's like, "Man, you should come to a rehearsal." So I had actually snuck in and out of a rehearsal. I think at Third Encore. And this is when I still, had a fiance. There's another, but no, this was all on the up and up. I'm like, sure, I'll swing by 3E on the way home. So I had poked in, and I think I'd seen the band when Steve was in it and some other stuff, and poked in.
Steve Vai?
Steve Vai.
I'm just trying to translate for these guys here.
Right, sorry, but no, so it was that band very early. Might have been 2005 or 6, whenever you guys were still before you guys had done any shows yet, right?
Yeah, well, we started touring in 2006, so it could have been late 2005 when we were doing rehearsals.
Right, so I think it was that, and I literally had just popped in, said hi to Jamie for a second. I kind of snuck back out, and then I think I saw the Wiltern show. Maybe the first time you guys were here in the balcony, saw the band, said hi, Jamie. Again, bailed out the back, saw the gig, and then at some point, and I was like, "Wow, that sax player's super cute." And then that's literally, I'll just leave it at that. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
But then so being able to just see her, and so now I actually get two things out of the way, so I can go see my wife out on the road, and then usually find some guitar time because it's usually. Just giving you props for this. You're usually pretty up on like new techniques and new players, so it's always fun to, post show, just kind of sit there and have you seen this guy? You seen this guy?
That's
pretty cool.
The crazy thing about this day and age is Instagram has become sort of like the new version of radio or television, and it's the place where you can tune into your specific favorite channel of guitar style. Yep. So there's a bunch of players out there, and we're always discovering people, and it's amazing what kids get up to these days. It's the same as the Olympics. That when they set the bar high, and then they shatter these records in the decathlon or whatever, and you think, oh, that's never going to be possible. There's no way somebody's going to run a 2-minute mile.
Oh, yeah.
But then suddenly somebody does something crazy. And so that's the thing with guitar players these days. There's some people out there that are doing crazy
just
stuff.
Ridiculous. And I will also give them some props too, because when I started, my wife is a sax player, is a jazz trained, actual classically trained musician, and I would walk around and I might play a Van Halen tune or something. She's like, "What's that?" And I'm just like, "Oh no, how do you not know this?" And then at some point she started catching on to more stuff. I'm like, "Oh, you've been listening to the stuff that Dweezil's playing, right?" She's actually started picking up Van Halen classics and more guitar stuff from hanging around Dweezil 24/7 on the road. So he's been training her right.
There you go. Speaking of Van Halen, did Van Halen produce a record for you when you were 12 years old?
The very first recording I ever made was, there was 2 songs. One was called My Mother is a Space Cadet, and the other song was called Crunchy Water. And I was 12 years old, and I had a group with some school friends, and one of them has also gone on to be like a big deal in the music business, a guy named Greg Kirsten, who has worked with Adele and a bunch of other people, and he's a great keyboardist and producer. But anyway, we were playing these songs in the basement, and somehow or another, there was a phone call that came to the house, and it turned out to be Edward Van Halen, and he came over to the house, and he met with my dad, and I got to meet him, and we played guitar, and Steve Vai came over because Steve was in my dad's band at the time, and so there was that meeting, but then a few months later, somehow or another, and I don't remember the details of how this occurred, but it ended up that Edward Van Halen produced these two songs that my little garage band was playing, and it was at the studio that was just built at our family home. My dad had just put this studio together. This is like early 1981, I think, is when the studio was finished, and then we recorded in there. In fact, the first thing that got recorded in that studio was a Missing Persons record.
Really?
And so, but we did these two songs. It was Edward Van Halen and Don Landy who did the original engineering on the first couple Van Halen records.
Yeah.
And so that was a crazy thing for a bunch of 12-year-olds. And Edward was not sure how to deal with all the kids. You know, he was, I don't know, are we supposed to take a milk and cookie break? Or, you know, so that was a fun experience. We did have a different drummer than my original drummer that was in my garage band at the time. It ended up being Warren Cucurulo's brother, who played just on that recording.
Well, you must have been the most popular kid in your school having Van Halen produce your record. I mean,
well, it was a weird kind of situation because it's nothing like today where, you know, you could go on Instagram or YouTube and see this kind of stuff happen, you know, like at any hour of the day, any day of the week. But back then, you know, it was quite astonishing to be anywhere close by to, you know, such a well-known musician who was so influential at the time too. I mean, obviously my dad was as well, but to the generation, you know, the kids and school and stuff like that, Van Halen was more well known. So it was definitely an interesting time.
Well, having a rock star dad like that must have been an interesting. I remember when I first came to L.A., you know, we'd drive through Laurel Canyon. People, oh, that's Frank Zappa's house over there, you know, and, you know, that was kind of like a tourist site, you know.
Well,
people point at
the
it.
log cabin is the one that people refer to, and that was, he lived there. He rented that place for a little while in like 1967, something like that, and then moved still in the Hollywood Hills area. And I guess within the last year and a half, 2 years, the house that I grew up in was bought by Lady Gaga. So it's
really.
You know, it's got the home studio in there that my dad built and everything. So, but that log cabin house was originally built by a film star that was like famous for westerns and stuff, and it had a bowling alley and weird stuff in it. And then like the Manson family kind of snuck around in the back hill back there. So that was why he left. My dad left. He's like, I can't be dealing with, you know, these kind of people.
Could be no Dweezil,
Yeah.
you know, so, or Dweezil could have been doing time or
Yeah.
something, I don't know.
Yeah.
Quite an education for a young man. So, and how do you guys, I mean, with the Universal Audio thing, is that a part of the connection with you guys? Because I know you have studio and all that.
Well, I mean, ultimately, we definitely bond over the studio gear and the guitar stuff and everything, and Universal Audio and Bill Putnam over there. You know, we all are friendly, but it's really, James and I started spending time mostly when he would visit on the road. He was visiting Sheila, and then I would just invite him to play with us for however many days that he was out visiting. So he just became a de facto, you know,
member of the band.
Yeah, and played on a few different songs, and he's played on some recordings that I've done, and so he's definitely, for those of you who don't know, he's one of the best guitar players in the world.
And I'll second that as well.
Well, and let me clarify.
And he's definitely one of the best guitar players in this room, too.
No, considering where we are, knowing that Steve's lives 10 minutes away, I'm gonna opt out of that. And a number of great Dweezil's, fantastic player, can play anything, and I will clarify that. I can usually only maintain 2 or 3 or 4 of the songs that you guys play at any one time, because they're very complicated songs. If you know the material, there are certain pieces of those songs that if you miss one note, it's like falling off a horse. You don't get back on in the middle of that song. And it can be a little intimidating. And it's even worse when he's like, no, it sounds fine. And I look at my wife and she's like, you sure you want to play that tonight? And it's happened a number of times. He's probably kind of glanced at that. It almost happened like, you're not playing that right. I'm like, oh. I'm like, okay. It's because she's the stickler. She's very precise in knowing all this stuff, and she's had 13 years I think of playing this material, and can pretty much sight read it.
She's pretty bulletproof when it comes to parts and everything, and that is very, very high praise considering like what we're talking about. The material is very difficult, so it's like being ready to do your best in the Olympics again, as an example. Like every moment on stage, like you have one chance to do it right. And her, she's very accurate with the stuff that she does, and very rarely has any kind of, thing happen where something goes off. And sometimes I will actually try, like when she has a difficult speech or something that she'll have to do, because sometimes there's sort of comedic elements that happen in some of the dialogue that might exist in songs. And sometimes I'll try to throw her off in that just to see if I can get her to slip up, and she's just rock solid.
She goes with it.
Yeah.
Well, if you screw up, all you got to do is just go, it's jazz. It's jazz, man. There are no wrong notes in jazz. You just, any messed up note, those are the good notes to a jazz guy.
But these audiences know every single note of these records and every version of every note. Yeah. I mean, the amount of pressure to play a 3-hour show, you make one mistake and be like, yeah, but they missed that one version from Helsinki where they probably should have played this. Like, oh man, seriously.
Yeah, there are a few people out there like that. There are
a lot of geeks out there, and I deal with them all. It's called Arrested Development. I mean, all these people, they never grew up, and they just, they live for this.
Well, I mean, it's a certain kind of audience that really appreciates it, and part of what we do with the music is to present it to an audience that didn't get a chance to see it live. So some of those people may not be as familiar, but it's creating that mix so that future generations are familiar with it and can appreciate it, because seeing this kind of stuff played live makes a big difference as opposed to just listening to it. When you actually see what happens and see how people have to relate to each other and see that this stuff can even be played, it really is a.
Well, I remember your dad's music was pretty complicated too. He was was he schooled? I'm sure he must have been.
He went to the library and taught himself everything about being a composer at 11 years old. That's he just said, I'm going to be a composer, and he went there and he learned all this stuff, and he discovered all these modern composers like Varese and Stravinsky. And at the time, this would have been, in the middle 50s or early 50s, or probably middle 50s. That stuff was still so advanced and ahead of its time. Things where you had an air raid siren as an instrument, and so that people didn't appreciate that at the time. But my dad, being a kid, he would see like a picture of Edgar Varese, whose hair looked like the front cover of the Eraserhead movie, and he said, "Who let a mad scientist make a record?" So he'd put this on, and at home his parents would say, "Turn that off," which is what people did to like rock and roll music, but this was classical music. They're like, "Turn that off." So he really liked all that kind of avant-garde stuff where you could hear dissonance and you could hear all these different rhythms and things that were not the average stuff from the so-called composers who wore the wigs, like Mozart and Beethoven and whatnot. So these sounds were interesting to him, and he developed all that stuff, and his music became more and more and more complicated as time went on. And to learn stuff from throughout his whole career it's mind-blowing in terms of the effort that it takes to learn it, memorize it, and keep it up to speed, So like what James was saying, he's learned a few songs, but he's learned maybe 3 or 4 where we've had to learn like 400 or something. And so keeping these things up and playable is very difficult.
And you were in Pretty in Pink, man. That's a cult movie.
Yes, well, it's one of those John Hughes films. Molly Ringwald was the star of the film, and at the time of the making of the film, I was dating Molly Ringwald. So you will see in the record store that she works in the film, there's a record on the wall that's the featured record of the week in the store. And it's My Mother is a Space Cadet single, the Dweezil single.
It's one way to promote yourself.
Yeah. But then I also had a very brief little appearance in the film where I was a friend of hers. We were in a club and watching I think it's like a reggae style band that's playing at the time. And somebody asked me the question, what was my name in the film? I think it was... I think you have it in the notes here. I have to remember myself. It's
Bobby?
No, it wasn't Bobby. It was somewhere. I'm looking for it. I can't find it. Anyway, whatever my name was in the film, it was so long ago. Somebody says to me, what would you do if your dad came home a rich man? And my big line in the film, after being my interest taken away from the reggae band, is I turn to them and say, "Kiss his ass."
There you go.
It was great. It was amazing. Yeah.
Well, that's good thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, you were a VJ for MTV.
I was on MTV when it was relatively new, and I was 17 years old, and I was doing some stuff on there where I was basically announcing videos. And then sometimes there would be some things where we would film things in the street or there'd be events, but I really was only doing a little bit of that stuff. I did about 12 weeks over a period of 2 years, but people thought I was on there more than I actually was. And one of the things that started taking place was at the time when something was in heavy rotation, it might play like 4, 5, or 6 times an hour. And so when you had to do something, you'd have to back announce it. So you would be if you had just seen the video, it would then come to the VJ on the screen, and it would say, "You just watched Lionel Richie dancing on the ceiling," And so after having to do that over and over, some of these videos I wasn't a fan of, and I just couldn't help but have to say some kind of comment.
I heard you went on Howard Stern, and that kind of ended that career. Right?
Well, it wasn't like a big deal for me because I was having some so. For example, there were also things where the sponsors would have slogans. There was 7-Up had "Feels so good coming down," So I'm supposed to say, "This is brought to you by 7-Up. Feels so good coming down." And then
sounds like a drug thing.
Yeah,
or
and
something.
then I would say, "From what?"
Yeah, really.
I'd look at the camera with a weird look, and then they would start to tell me, "Oh, you can't do that." I'm like, "Well, I can't not do that because that's just how I feel about it, And so, at a certain point, it was just something that they didn't appreciate anymore. So I just didn't. I wasn't working there anymore, but. It was sort of the precursor to Beavis and Butthead and making comments about videos and things, because at a certain point that started to happen.
And you did some of that too, right? Weren't you the voice of?
I wasn't on Beavis and Butthead, but I was on a show called Ajax. I mean, it was Duckman, and I was a character called Ajax. But that was a few years after the whole MTV stuff, and but there was one time on MTV where I did have my dad visit, and I got to interview him on camera, and that was pretty funny because there was a video that got played, and at the time it was it had to have a warning before the video because it had some footage in it that apparently was provocative.
Inappropriate?
Well, it had at the end of the video somebody is they get hung at the gallows, and so my dad says, kids, do not try this at home unless you're a Republican. Then try it every day.
There you go.
Yeah, so that was pretty good. It was interesting to see that get on the air. And he talked a lot about Pat Robertson at the time and the whole 800-foot Jesus thing that was going on with, the evangelists. And he had a good time talking about that stuff. But I also got to interview Les Paul on there, which was a really cool thing.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
Well, the good news, like on this podcast, is you can say whatever the fuck you want. So,
Perfect.
I mean, so I don't really care. I frown on bad words, but what the fuck?
But
So,
he's holding a Les Paul, and it's actually kind of based on some stuff your dad did. So maybe that's a cool time to
and you had a
talk
guitar.
about it.
He had a guitar that was stolen that this is based on, right?
Yeah, so there's an album called Hot Rats, which is one of my dad's most popular records, and interestingly about that album, it's mostly instrumental, but it has a couple of songs on it that are perhaps his most well-known, like Peaches on Regalia, and Willie the Pimp is a well-known song from that. But on that record, he played a guitar that looked very much like this guitar. The guitar that he actually played was stolen in about 1970 or 71, something like that. The record was made in '69. But the guitar originally started as just a regular gold top with cream-colored P90s.
Right.
Didn't have a bass
Vibrato.
B or anything like that. But then, as you can see, he transformed it into something that nobody else would probably ever do to a Les Paul. He put a
Other than
Telecaster.
Ted Green. Ted
Other
Green,
than like one other guy.
Yeah, so he put a Telecaster pickup here next to the bridge. There's a Bigsby that's way down at the bottom. And then you can knock things in and out of phase. I added some stuff that the guitar didn't have because I have other things that I need to be able to do with this guitar. So it has a piezo bridge system that I can blend in. But essentially I have control over these pickups and I can knock them out of phase and create all kinds of
Cool.
very different kind of stringy and mid-rangey sounds that help recreate the sound of that record.
And so you can do everything from playing like classical music to make like farm animal sounds.
Well,
out of that
I
thing,
could
or-
probably make a couple farm animal sounds with it, but ultimately, this guitar, I really wanted to put it together for this tour that I'm doing, which starts in September, which is we're going to play the entire Hot Rats album from top to bottom.
Very cool.
Which I'm going to be playing a lot of stuff exactly note for note, and it just helps to have a guitar that makes very much the same sound that my dad used at that time in order
Cool.
to. Because one of the layers of detail that we go into when we do this stuff is we look at it like it's layers of DNA material. If we know that, for example, a song was recorded on an API console, we have technology that we use with our front of house mixing equipment where we can route digitally. We can use the digital version of an API console, and we can use everything that we know of information-wise to recreate the signal path for each song. So if we know
Very
that a
cool.
different one was done on a Neve console and we know it had a DBX 160 compressor or whatever, we can create all of that signal path and then use similar instruments and all these things. So it's all the way down to that layer of detail that we try to recreate the music.
That's some pretty geeky stuff. And I would assume maybe, James, are you involved in any of this geekiness or what?
I get to see it as it moves along through sometimes the rehearsals and sound checks. And Dweezil can tell you back. It's a constant struggle, and I see it because he'll do a show, then I'll see him. He'll be on the bus listening to the show that just happened. So because that's one of those things you have to constantly refine that kind of stuff. It's again 3 hours of music. How many songs? Plus making sure the mixes get better as the tour progresses. So it's actually quite a bit of work to maintain that level of detail.
There are a lot of
Dweezil,
segues in between
Oh,
tunes
man.
and all
Yeah,
that kind of stuff.
that's the thing about my dad's live concerts is that rarely do songs just end and there's time wasted on stage. He gave the audience the maximum amount of music that they could tolerate.
Yeah.
And so that's the way we do the shows as well. I mean, a show is a typical show for us is 2 hours, 15 minutes, but it can be longer depending on the material. And we've had shows that are 3 hours, just because some material is longer than others, and the segues though are pretty extravagant. So you might have periods in a show where you'll be playing from song to song to song. They all segue together, and you don't have a break for like 30, maybe 40 minutes.
Wow.
And then if I have to change guitars or something, there'll be a break. But even then, we might have like a little vamp going on underneath, so it might sound like the theme from Price is Right or something. While I go get a new guitar.
Well, like talking about taking things to extreme, what was this thing? What the hell was I thinking? What were you doing on that? What the hell were you thinking?
Well, I haven't finished it yet. So the idea started way back when. It's basically an instrumental record that has, it changes musical styles, and the atmosphere, the recording atmosphere changes from moment to moment. So if you were trying to dial in music on an old radio, it's kind of like that, basically, because you hear little bits of things that catch your ear, and then you tune into something else. And this piece of music is segued like that, where it morphs from one thing into another. But as it's happening, all the styles change, and you will hear different guitar players actually make guest appearances. So there's about 45 different guitar players on there.
Like who?
Like Angus and Malcolm Young, who I don't believe have played on anything other than AC/DC. And then Brian May, Eric Johnson, Steve Vai, Steve Morse, Albert Lee, Brian Setzer, Edward Van Halen.
Which Eddie never plays on anybody's stuff, right? I mean, that's like the big thing, is he doesn't play on anybody's stuff.
Are you going to try to get some well-known guitar players?
I should. I should see if there's like a couple I could get. Maybe you could help me.
All right.
But I think so. There's a few more people that I'd like to have on there before I wrap this thing up. But I started it, I think, around 1990. And so
do you have like a finish date, or is this like
I haven't really
never-ending?
I haven't worked on it every year since then, because I got busy with this whole tour that I've been doing, and I started in 2006 playing a lot of my dad's music and everything. So honestly, I've been starting to think about maybe I'll have some time next year to take a little bit of time to wrap it up and put it all together. But it's good that technology has changed, and I'll be able to do some other things, because I originally wanted to be able to mix it in surround sound and deliver it that way. So that's something that I still plan to do, because it's there's so many textures, and it's all essentially just guitar, bass, and drums. There really aren't any other instruments.
Well, if you wait any longer, it's going to be like ultimate surround sound, or there'll be some technology that we haven't even thought of yet. I mean, this is a long time project.
Yeah, well, the thing about the surround sound stuff.
I was a young man when you started this
thing. Yes, me too. But the surround sound will really make it possible to really dial into the details, because if you listen to something that is mixed in surround sound, it has less compression, it has less things to be in the way to mask the instruments. So you'll be able to feel like you can reach out and touch the guitar that's coming out of the speaker there. And so that kind of stuff is what I want to be able to present with the record when it's done.
Cool. Do you ever use the aux? That, by the way, I got to give some props there to James. He developed this thing called the aux, and many guitar players, a lot of them that I know, are so concerned with getting their sound that they play so loud by turning their amp up that it's painful for the audience, but they get their sound. So, James, tell us about the aux. What was the deal with that?
Well, it's going to be a boring talk, but basically old amps you got to turn them up. Let's say if you're Van Halen, you got to put the Marshall on like 10 basically, which is not good for anybody. But a lot of us have these amps. In fact, in Dweezil's situation, he's got a lot of this stuff, but I think you're still in the process of putting the studio together, having a place to put everything. So I think for a lot of us the tools will dictate what you need to use during the day. whether at least a lot of touring guys have. There's things like fractals. There's low wattage amps you can have, but there's nothing like having the real thing, and taming those beasts are pretty hard to do. So it was just a box to allow you to take all your old non-master volume amps, what they used to call them, and put them wherever they sound good, and get into Pro Tools or get into the PA.
And get a natural.
And get a natural, like studio, ambient, multiple mic technique sound.
But what you haven't mentioned yet is that it actually provides the speaker cabinets.
Right. It's all the speaker cabinets, the microphones, the room itself, the console where you can mix things, put on the plate reverb. So if you took like a Marshall head, you plug into this, you could finish the entire signal path from like Van Halen 1. Put the plate reverb over here, put a little EQ over here, mix two microphones and two speakers, kind of blended. And so it's a fun playground for that, because most people don't have the room or the constraints of living.
In the world.
Yeah, you're in an apartment, or you live in a place where you've got neighbors are right up to you. You just can't turn those amps up. And I love those old amps, and I think even your rig, if you were to look at it over the years, you did start with multiple tube amps and a pretty large rig that's now been, it's hard to tour with a rig that big and with these old amps that need repairing or the volume's an issue. And
well, my dad's, the different sounds that he made and the different gear that he used all the time, I originally did do it all analog with the different amps, had to use 3 amps, and it was like 2 refrigerator size racks and all this stuff, and over 200 cables to plug in. And that's just, over time when you're traveling, it's very expensive, number one, but it's also, you're just asking for trouble because cables.
Something breaks, you got to figure out which one's broken.
And so, I went to a modeling style rig because it gave me more flexibility to be able to recreate the sounds from the records. And, there's going to always be somebody that's going to say, oh, well, the digital stuff doesn't sound as good as the real analog stuff. And these days, I mean, if you listen to a recording, you're hard pressed to tell what's what. And it just, if it sounds good and you like playing with that sound, then that's what's going to make the show work for you. So I don't get too precious about what the signal path actually has to be in terms of actual vintage hardware and whatnot. I mean, I can appreciate all that stuff just like anybody else, but at the end of the day, I have to make, dozens and dozens of complicated sounds, and I have to route it different way from preset to preset. And so the modeling stuff with the fractal works best for me. But I do like the thing that James made, because the thing that the box that James made is it is to help you get that vintage sound with the amp that you love. And the digital side of it, the speaker side of it, is really, really good and sounds amazing. So, again, this is one of those things where you're going to have somebody say, well, it's a vintage amp, but it's not a vintage speaker. Yeah. And, so these are the cork sniffer guys that are going to be sitting over there chained to the wall eating dog food, arguing
Yeah. Well, and I can be that way, too. There are times for that. When we could talk about guitar, we'll talk about this one, the time to nitpick and about vintage things. But And I I've had to let this go in the years of sometimes playing with Dweezil, and it's like, hey, you want to play that? And I've got no power. I'll play through whatever. Sometimes it's a mental block, because if you let the gear dictate how you're going to play and sound, you kind of lose.
Well, it's the application too. If you're doing something that's really complicated, you got to go with what you got to go with.
And you can have fun. Music's supposed to be fun. It's supposed to be fun to play guitar. So, and a lot, which maybe people forget, a lot of bands these days travel in inner monitors. So even if I had a wall of amps, I'd be in, I'd have something in my ear blocking it out because you're listening to a monitor mix.
There's a band that plays around town who has a record that's coming out. It's called the Dirty Nobs. It's Mike Campbell and my friend Jason Santiago. And those guys are using, both of them have exactly the same setup. They've got an early 50s deluxe amp, Tweed Deluxe, and a Princeton Reverb wired together. And they both get fantastic sounds. Of course, it's not complicated like your music. Right. It's much more basic and all that kind of stuff. So, there's all kinds of schools of thought. We don't want to get too complicated, with all our people, because I got a lot of knuckleheads that come to my store and like the cool vintage stuff and want all that. And there's a place for all of this stuff.
Absolutely. I mean, it's if you can use that stuff and it works, it's great in the studio. It can be great live as well. obviously that's what we're all used to when we see and listen to,
All our favorite old
yeah.
records.
Yeah, so, I mean, obviously we know that stuff is cool and great, but you have to sort of be able to work as a team player these days. And,
Right.
and the reality is to get really good live sound, you need it to be really controlled on stage so that the front of house engineer can do what he needs to do to put things in the right place in the speakers for the audience. So if you're too loud on stage, you're not going to be in the PA. You're just going to
Your engineer must be losing his mind during those shows.
Well, he's actually helped, shape the way that the sound is on stage, and we play pretty quiet on stage, really. I mean, like when James plays with us, and he plays with a little combo amp. I mean, I have like a 10-watt Marshall.
Yeah, something like you just put it on like 8 and plug it, and hope for the best.
Yeah, and you can hear that on stage against the drum kit, and it's like, so we're not really super loud on stage, and it helps with all the dynamics.
Well, you can hear what you're doing.
Yeah.
So, James, this guitar that you're playing here, this is a pre-CBS Strat.
Yeah, actually, there's some interesting things to it, which kind of relate to that guitar, and maybe another guitar that Dweezil owns was back in the day when everyone started seeing people jam humbuckers in the Stratocasters.
Yeah.
The sort of thing where, and the reason this one's kind of fun is, I think when we opened it up, we had found that probably in the late 70s, thanks to probably Edward Van Halen, there was a big giant route for a humbucker under the pickguard. Which, again, makes sense because I think once you have you play a Gibson, you play a Strat, you're like, I want that in there. You start thinking these ideas, which is exactly what this, this Les Paul over here is if you don't mind that, which I think is the forward-thinking part of players like a Frank or a Jimi Hendrix, where it's like, you know what, it's if you were cork sniffing all the time, you'd never have any fun. You gotta get new sounds, get inspired to play something else different. So I appreciate the guy who at some point hacked this thing to pieces.
Well, you like player grade stuff because then you've got the feel of old. You got old wood, you got old pickups, but you can kind of
it's
a fraction of the price, and
absolutely.
you can kind of experiment a bit. I know you have some straight stuff and
some straight stuff,
some
actually,
player grade.
This is a fun thing. So yeah, this specific guitar. And then maybe this is a question for you. Is I think you bought a bunch of stuff up some crazy collector repair guy.
Yeah.
And this was one of the things about. In fact, it came in that day. Blues Saraceno in blues has been you've known blues for ages, right?
Yep.
Like a long time. So
I was going to bring that up. That he's a buddy of mine too.
Great player. Has some
another guy with a funny first name.
Yeah,
right?
that's right.
What's your first name? Blues.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. No, he's got a bunch of these early CBs. He's bought from you, I think. Actually, like a 63 or 64. So we came in together, started looking through all this stuff, and there was this one poor thing in the back. I mean, I think the frets were green, like the 3-way switch was bent and stuck and rusty. Well, I plugged it in, and it just had this really huge, big, fat, woody sound to it for some reason. But under the pickguard, this guy must have done all sorts of experiments because, like each one of the pickups came from probably a different Stratocaster.
Yep.
So they were all, one was wired out of phase and knocked out, which you can do on purpose, like on a guitar like Dweezil's, or some people like to throw the pickup electrically out of phase. It kind of does this notch thing, where it almost sounds like a harpsichord almost. You get that really penny little sound out of it. But I took it as a fun challenge to put it all back together. It's got new frets again, nut, and put the wiring back. And so here's something fun for the super guitar nerds about it is one of the pickups was actually the wrong year for this era. Because as you research your guitars, if you took like a 54 Strat and put one of the pickups in a 64 Strat, they'd be reversed. At some point, Fender started winding the pickups the wrong direction.
This is pretty geeky stuff.
So, yeah. But in 1962, for some reason, the winding machine went the other direction. So if you were to mix those two pickups, they would do that naturally. They'd knock out of phase. So that guitar had one of these. It's like, okay, so this guy had a 64. He was playing with the pickups, stuck it in the middle, and that's like, when the first day I played it, it's like the 2 and 4 position did not work. It was all wrong. So I started scratching my head thinking, well, that's not cool, but whatever. It was a player-grade guitar. I was having fun playing it. And then you realize, like, well, okay, so if it's backwards, well, that's what we now call reverse wound. And reverse winding is how you actually get hum canceling on a guitar. So I actually just decided, just figured this out last month, literally just took the black and put it on the lead. So this guitar naturally now does hum canceling. I moved it in the middle, wired it backwards, and now it is hum canceling in the 2 and 4, but it's still original Fender pickups.
Well,
we're very weird. Sorry, super techie.
Yeah, back in the day too, people would take those three-way switches and put notches in there, so you
Right.
get in the middle to get kind of thinner, out-of-phase type
Out-of-phase
sounds, and
stuff.
that was kind of a big thing back in the day.
And it's still the
they-
three-way, so we
Yeah.
still have the original three-way. You're right, and so if you go to, you can hear the noise, but you go to the 2 and 4, it's quiet, it's still original. But another fun thing we should probably bring up too is like when you listen to Hendrix tunes and he's doing that kind of stuff on the, can you hear this? That classic 2 and 4 positions and stuff. I don't have a 5-way switch. I'm actually very quickly dangling that switch, jamming it in between the 3 and 5. So it's still, you can see where it's sitting there, but it is a 3-way switch, the original, which if you listen to Clapton's like Lay Down Sally or any of the Hendrix stuff,
Yeah.
they were all 3-way switches.
How did Lay Down Sally go?
Uh,
I just want to put them to work. I don't know. So you hear a little music.
And then you'll have to take it out because you don't have the rights
That's
to
true. There we go. That's a little different, but that's a classic thing, and maybe a fun thing to talk about is I know you also get into the Hendrix motor research. So I think you and Eric are doing another run of that stuff in September, right?
I think it's October.
Or October.
But yeah, so the Experience Hendrix tour, which is a fun thing to do, and I often get to play songs with Eric Johnson, which, you know, that's
Another one of the real greats
yeah,
there.
yeah, and he's on that. I think I mentioned him.
Another one of
on-
my students.
Oh yeah, he's on that. What the hell was I thinking? Record as well. But yeah, you know, I mean, if we're talking about guitars and guitar tone, who doesn't like the sound of Jimi Hendrix? You know, so everybody's always
Yeah.
trying to, you know, find a way to make their guitar and their amps sound like that. And there's lots of different ways to do it, but obviously, you know, he did it the best.
Well, you know, you got to make your fingers sound like Jimi Hendrix first.
That's tough.
So we're going to take a little break, and we're going to come back, and we're going to talk about a couple things. Dweezil brought in a couple guitars that were pretty important historical guitars to the store over the years, and I think, you know, there's some cool stories behind it. We're going to get into that in a few minutes. So I want to thank my buddy James Santiago, the great Dweezil Zappa. We're going to be back in just a minute with more geeky stuff, but for all you guitar lovers, and you know, you know, it's really cool because I get to hang with my buddies, and we can talk some crazy stuff that you know, it's the guitar language that we all speak, and
Love it.
you know, we might be putting some of you to sleep, but you know, tough shit. You know, that's all I can say. So anyhow, we're going to take a little break. We're going to be back in a minute, so please stick around right here. Hey, we're back at the Norm's Rare Guitars podcast. That's kind of like Blues from Calcutta or something. There's some Indian thing happening there. I'm not sure, not like the American Indian, but like the Indian Indian. Some different scales and all that kind of stuff. So we're going to talk a little bit about a couple guitars that Dweezil brought in. One being the Strat that Jimi Hendrix gave to your dad.
Yes, I did. I brought that in one time. It's a well-known guitar for some people, but if you've never heard about it, it's one of the ones that was burned. It was burned at the Astoria in London, and the neck was obviously roasted, and it wasn't usable anymore. But the guitar itself was put back together. Well, it was given to my dad in Miami at the Miami Pop Festival because Jimmy.
I was there, by the way.
Yeah?
I grew up in Miami.
That's
I
pretty
was there.
sweet.
And by the way, when Jimmy came in at the Miami Pop Festival, a lot of people maybe don't know this, but what happened was they didn't announce who the final act was. And it was big hype, and they were saying surprise final act. And 2 helicopters come and land. It was at a, you know, out at a racetrack out there, and these two helicopters come in and land. People going, it's the Beatles, who knows, who it was. And then all of a sudden, Jimi comes out of one. And, back in the day, everybody had to tune up before they played, but he was tuned, and bass player and drummer, Mitchell, and, came out of the other helicopter. They just walked in, plugged in the amps, and just went right into it and blew everybody's mind. And Jimi at the time was really hungry and playing at his best and just killed everybody. It was unbelievable.
That video of them doing Foxy Lady from that was probably one of the best versions ever of that song. But the weirdest part, though, is if you see the audience, it's like some white teenagers with the sweaters tied around their neck, and they're giving it a golf clap afterwards. And it's like, what? Come on,
Well, that was kind of a transition in time right there. There was the guys that were the jocks that were kind of into it, that just wanted to bring their girlfriends to kind of show them that they actually liked music, make some points with them, and
but
then there was the long hairs.
It's pretty wild, though, because that is an amazing performance. I mean, you're right. He just killed it when he went out there. But then you see the audience reaction, which was like a little limp-wristed there.
Oh, I think it's as bad as like the Stevie Ray thing when he goes to like the Montreux Jazz Festival and plays, and they're like, boo!
Well, that's like Dylan.
You couldn't appreciate it. Yeah. Dylan
Because it was so radically different from anything else that was going on that people didn't know. A lot of times, when people who don't know about music, they kind of look at each other and go, that was good, wasn't it? And they kind of clap politely because they don't know if it's good or bad. They just want to, they don't want to look lame that they don't.
They don't want to be the leader. They have to be able to follow somebody. If somebody else is going to clap, I'll happily clap along.
Right. Yeah. So if it's good, that's like in a lot of jazz clubs. The guys look at each other and go, that was really good, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And so...
I really dig what you were trying to do up there.
It was good, really.
I'm not sure, whatever you were trying to do, it was good that you were trying to do it.
Yeah.
So tell us about that guitar.
So that guitar was given to my dad at that show, and it sat around at our house nailed to the wall in the basement for a few years. But then eventually my dad took the body of it, which was all burnt, and he had Rex Bogue, who was a luthier in the 70s, who built a bunch of stuff for different people, and he put it back together, and it had a lot of crazy things in it at first. It had a hot dot pickup, which was before piezo pickups, so it was it was put into the guitar. So my dad was trying to get a more immediate string reaction, something that felt like the guitar was resonating, and so that was there was a preamp for that, and but it had the original burnt pickup covers, not the pickups, because those were destroyed. And he put it together, and he was on the cover of Guitar Player in 1977 with that guitar. And,
I remember that.
And then it changed a few times with different necks and different pick guards with different electronics over the years. And at one point it disappeared, and I found it at our house under a staircase, not in a case,
good place
all
for
taken
it.
apart.
Piece of historic memorabilia,
Yeah, at that point I put it back together as more of a stock 60s Strat for my dad, and he was ill at the time, so he couldn't play it anymore. He just was like, I can't even play anymore. So he said, do you want it? I said, well, of course.
Yeah.
So, and then I set about I made it so it looked like it was on the 1977 Guitar Player cover, and that's when I brought it into you.
Right.
So we showed it right when I got it finished, being refurbished like that. So it's a cool guitar.
Absolutely. And you were given another gift that was pretty cool from...
Oh, well, I got a guitar from Edward Van Halen that was... it was another one of these like sitting in the corner situations. I had seen as a kid, Life magazine, there was a picture of Ed backstage, and there was a guitar that was on a guitar stand, and it was the only guitar he had that had any green. The color green was just, it wasn't on any of his guitars up until that point. So this was like 1982, 83, something like that. And anyway, later on, when I was at his studio years later, I said, oh, hey, that's the guitar from Life magazine. And it was what he called the Rasta guitar, and it had the green and the red and the black and the yellow. But the guitar neck was off of the guitar, and in the neck joint, it appeared that somebody had vomited in the neck joint at some point. So he's like, oh yeah,
You got to play the right notes. That's the problem.
Yeah. So, but he said, I don't really play that guitar. You want that guitar? And I said, yeah, sure. So, but it turns out that guitar, if you look through the paint, it has the circles and the man lying down. It's the one that he used in the video from the Oakland concerts where they're playing Unchained and Hear About It Later and all that stuff. And but the guitar is really heavy. I mean, it feels like it weighs like
it's 1,000 pounds.
Yeah.
Well, what does vomit weigh when it's been sitting there for 20 years?
So,
you can't really weigh vomit or dust for
Well, it
There's
depends
just
what
societal
the consistency of the vomit is. I mean, the guy might have like pork chops or something, and then
But it's real
threw
Van
it back
Halen
up.
vomit,
I don't
though.
know.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's a when you really want to go to the full DNA level of this guitar, it has real DNA history, so.
Real, but
Yeah.
that's a fun guitar, and I think if you look at the history of it, that band was probably at its best in those years. I think it was only 3 songs that came from this. It was Oakland Coliseum? 3 or 4 songs.
Yeah.
The band was amazing sounding, and you see them where, for anyone who doesn't know, Unchained actually has a drop D on top of being a half step down, which I was guessing probably why that guitar was set up for the extra drop D on top of the half step down to do Unchained, to do it right.
Yep.
And you see, it's got the circles. And we've looked at the guitar before, and if you put it in the right light, you just see those kind of crop circles.
Yeah, and you can
under all
see
that
it on
paint.
the back
Yeah.
where it says "Bye, see you
Right.
later."
See you later. Yeah.
Yeah, the little message when he would flip the guitar up and show that message to the audience, so that you could see that on the back of there. But yeah, that guitar it's got a great history to it. It's it's a unique instrument because you know it from those performances and stuff. But I mean, and those are such classic riffs. And that version of Unchained is so cool because he has that one part where he goes to the verse early and changes the arrangement there, and it's just really cool.
Yeah, it's like and there's another guy who was not afraid with, because you think about, well, why did he paint it? Then you think of his main guitar started as white and black with a pickguard, and then loses the pickguard, then it starts getting red in it.
Yeah.
So you see in his mind, I think much like the guitar you're holding that was based on your dad's stuff, these guys were always pushing forward. They didn't cork sniff too much. It's like, no, I'm looking for new sounds, whatever gets me there, and you burn the bridge behind you, basically.
Yeah, well, the thing too is that I think really when you start to get to that place where you're in the process of being creative and making music, you want to be able to sort of let whatever's happening, you want to respond to what's going on around you. And so if you're open to that and the sounds that are happening, you're going to want to take it to another place. If you stay too much in this one area, you may never discover what else you can do. And but there are some artists that stay in one area and everybody loves them for being right
traditional.
there. Yeah, or like Angus Young. I mean, AC/DC. How many ballads do they have? Exactly 0.
Zero. What guitar? An SG and a Marshall. It never changed.
Yeah, it's
literally.
like he played slide on something recently, and people were like, "No, dude."
No.
Yeah, those folks aren't, too open to,
change.
new things.
Yeah.
So.
But I want to ask you one question though, because on that same topic, how many guitars have you sold that left in one condition and a week later came back completely different? And I think one maybe good example is the one you sold to Robbie Robertson.
Oh yeah,
It was like a vintage Strat that then got bronzed and dipped and cut to pieces.
Well, actually, it was a 1954 Strat, and the guitar player in my band, Dan Walsh, we had a band named after his white Samoyed dog. We were called the Charlie Dog Band, and we were a product of a lot of hallucinogenics and stuff like that. But anyhow. He had asked me to sell his guitar, and I ended up selling it to Robbie Robertson. It was originally transparent red, and Robbie dipped it in some gold. I don't know, it was like a gold paint. And his thing was he would take 2 Gibson Melody Maker pickups, wire them together, and made a humbucker out of these 2 pickups, and that was kind of the secret to his sound.
And that's like the Last Waltz, basically.
The Last Waltz, yeah. So if you look at the Last Waltz, we supplied all the instruments to that. And that was, he had a lot of tweed amps, and he had all kinds of stuff. There were a lot of great guitars in that movie, some real one-of-a-kinds. It was the #1 Gibson Citation that was used. I think that was a Staple Singers thing. And there was, another Martin Cowood 00045K, the only one ever made. There was a lot of really cool stuff, and Robbie at the time knew that the film company was going to pay for instruments in there, so he said, let's go into your warehouse and pick out some stuff. And he knew exactly what he was doing and bought a lot of really cool guitars for me that were used in The Last Waltz. And I always loved that movie. I think it's the greatest movie documentary on music at that time. Really captured all the top artists of the day, and it's a fantastic movie. If you haven't seen it, you should see it.
Yeah, it's interesting that for some reason I'm okay with that. It's a 54 Strat that got transformed.
Well, it was already
going
refinished,
somewhere.
and he could justify it. And it was just like Ted Green too. Where Ted would modify guitars and he would use them, and how could you tell Ted Green?
Oh yeah, because they're
don't
going
do
for
it?
a sound in
How
the
do you
head?
tell Frank Zappa? Don't do it.
Yeah.
They're
going
it's
somewhere
like,
you haven't gone yet. They're trying new things.
Right.
You got to appreciate the artistry to push forward and go somewhere no one else has gone yet, or at least try.
Have you ever seen a 59 Les Paul come in with a Kaler on it?
No, that I haven't. That I think I would draw the line there. But I did see one time when I was in Miami before I left. I'll never forget this. I was in a guitar repair shop, and this was in the late '60s. And a guy had a Sunburst Les Paul, and he was a 59, and he put it behind his car, and he was about to load it in his trunk, forgot about it, got in his car, backed up, and ran over it. And so this repairman was putting the neck back together, which was in a lot of pieces. So that was about as modded I've ever seen a Les Paul of that era. And
Nice. I'm sure he was happy about that.
yeah, it was not one of his better days, but especially now knowing how much they go for, wasn't exactly his brightest move. But I just want to say I am so lucky to have guys like this to be able to do this, to come in and do our podcasts. And you're going to see the film of this later on the All Guitar Network, and the podcast will be released first. We love you guys for listening to this stuff. We get a little geeky, but it's three buddies sitting around talking guitar stuff. And I just can't thank you folks enough. We've had such a great reaction to our social media, our videos and all that. Dweezil, when you came in and you did your videos with the store with both the Stratocaster and the Van Halen guitar, people love that stuff. So I can't thank you guys enough. We are humbled by it, and I do appreciate you guys, actually giving us the time of day. And James Santiago, one of the great guitar players. If you haven't heard James play, we're talking about all this other technical stuff, but James can play his butt off. And the reason that you were hired, is because you could kind of emulate a lot of different things. You have your own style and everything, but you can play in anything. That's why I asked you to play Lay Down Sally before. I just wanted to mess you up.
I got about 4 good seconds of me of certain players before your hands fall apart. Like, you can't do Stevie Ray unless you dedicate your life to that. But I can get 3 seconds in before I go down.
Before it's like Stevie Ray, Santiago.
That's right. That's right. It's all over. Yeah, it's all over. But I got a few seconds in me. I'll let that joke drop right there.
There you go. Well, thank you guys again for listening to this stuff and watching the thing on All Guitar Network. All Guitar Network's free, so you can sign up for that. This podcast is the greatest. The great Dweezil Zappa.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, man. You're an old friend, and I can't thank you enough. The great James Santiago. Can you take us out with a little bit of music and just send us back into the ozone?
We'll see.
Yeah.
We'll see.
Pick a key. Should we try something different?
I don't know, man. I always look at everything in A Dorian, even if it's not.
All right.
You're gonna make it bossa nova. Okay, here we go. This will be weird. Ready?
That's jazz, folks.
Yeah, it's like almost like that. Just reminded me of a heart song for something. And I don't know which one.
If I play it,
I think it was about 3 or 4 of them at one time.
Oh,
There you go.
Yeah,
All right, we'll end on that
enough.
note. Thank you guys for listening. Norm's Yard Guitars Podcast. Dweezil Zappa, James Santiago. Thank you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.